You are listening to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr Nerida, and with a change of season rapidly approaching, today our topic of conversation is laminitis. So for anyone who owns a horse or pony who has had a previous episode of laminitis, or if you own a horse or pony who is at risk of laminitis, I get where you're at a change of season, because 3 of my horses, actually 2 horses and 1 pony, I watch like a hawk for laminitis. 2 of them have previously had laminitis, and the pony is a pony. She's never had laminitis, but I essentially just treat all ponies as being at risk, because typically their little genetic makeup means that they are at much higher risk of laminitis than most other breeds of equine, or at high risk than most other breeds of horses. So just a little bit of background for me on this subject. I really do think as a nutritionist that the equine conditions that I get to experience firsthand are the ones that I do the best job of in my profession. And unfortunately, I've had a lot of experience with laminitis, and it was quite a number of years ago now. It must be 10 years ago now. I had 3 horses at the time. 2 of them I still have, and they all got laminitis within the space of 2 weeks of one another in the middle of summer. And it just left me thinking, what the heck is going on? We're in one of what I would consider one of the lower risk periods throughout a 12-month period in summer, and all 3 of these horses, 2 of them had never had laminitis before, and 2 I considered a reasonably low risk at the time due to their age and their workload and things like that, and they all got laminitis. So looking back, it was a combination of things. So my pastures at the time were quite phosphorus and sulfur deficient, and plant nutrient deficiencies will cause plants to do the things they do, accumulate starches and sugars and become very unsafe for horses prone to laminitis. And we had also sprayed all of our pastures, and stupidly, I hadn't taken the horses off the pastures when they had been sprayed, and it's always made me wonder, and it's not an experiment I want to repeat, but it's always made me wonder whether the chemical actually caused some sort of microbial cascade in their gut that then led to them all getting laminitis in such a short time frame. But anyway, thankfully I knew what to do. I picked it up really early. I got them onto an emergency diet very quickly. I had their feet attended to by a farrier who was really experienced in that area. And they were all sound within, I want to say, a matter of days. Definitely at the walk, they were sound in a matter of days, and then they were sound. And 2 of them have been, one mare was a very old mare, but the 2 that I still have with me, I mean, they've been well and truly back in work since then. One of them was my daughter's competition horse, so she's done many a mile barefoot since then as well. So if you catch it early enough, it's not a life sentence for them. I'd love to say that up front. So if you've got a horse that is struggling with laminitis, if you catch it early enough and do all the right things, then you can get them back to being perfectly sound and definitely able to go back into work. One of my favourite memories throughout my career was a horse that was literally going to be put down with laminitis because the owners just could not get its feet right. And then thankfully I ended up being involved, and the horse went on to win at the highest level in its sport. I think it was like the following year. It was such an amazing turnaround. So when you know what to do and when to do it at the right times, then yeah, definitely you can bring horses back from laminitis. And if anyone, I had a gorgeous friend whose pony got laminitis, and she was giving herself a really hard time, saying, how can I have let this happen? But honestly, it's one of those diseases that will sneak up and get you sometimes when you're not even expecting it. But with what we're going to talk about in this podcast, hopefully you'll learn a few things that will help you know when the high risk times are throughout the 4 seasons of the year, and also what you can monitor to see if your horse is actually at risk of or starting to develop laminitis, so that you can do something really quickly. So 90% of laminitis cases are estimated to be caused by a condition called insulin dysregulation. So insulin dysregulation, big fancy words to describe a condition where horses release an unusual amount of insulin in response to glucose going into their bloodstream. So when horses eat starch or sugars, when the starch and sugars go into the horse's small intestine, the enzymes in the small intestine, which I talk about a lot, so enzymes are like little pairs of scissors that do the digestion work of cutting big stuff into little stuff. Enzymes in the small intestine cut the starches and sugars into single glucose pieces, and then glucose is absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. And then the horse's body picks up that there's too much glucose in the bloodstream. So glucose, as it is for us as humans, needs to be regulated in a tight range. So when a horse absorbs glucose into its bloodstream, the pancreas picks up on that and it goes, oh, there's too much glucose in the bloodstream, and it will release the hormone insulin. And then insulin's job is to circulate around in the blood and essentially go and knock on the muscle cell or on all the muscle cells and say, hey, there's too much glucose in the bloodstream. Can you open up and let some in and store it for later? And then the muscle cells, it's like something out of a sci-fi, the muscle cells then get these little GLUT4 transporters to go up to the surface of the cell, and they will then suck glucose into the cell, and then the muscle cell puts those glucose molecules back together into a compound called glycogen, and it stores that glycogen to be released at some point in the future when a horse needs to fuel its muscles with glucose. So if you've got a performance horse, you'll be quite familiar with the terminology glycogen, because it's the glycogen that we want to make sure their muscles are actually full of, so that they've got plenty of stored energy for when they need it when they're doing their performance work. But in an insulin dysregulated horse, what happens is the muscle cells, it's almost like they're deaf to the message of insulin. So the insulin will knock on the muscle cell and go, hey, there's too much glucose out here, open up and let some in. But the muscle cell does nothing. So it doesn't move its glucose transporter, it doesn't suck glucose in. But all the pancreas sees is that there's still too much glucose in the bloodstream, so it releases more insulin. And the insulin tries to get the muscles to take up the glucose to lower the blood glucose level. It's this cascade effect where the pancreas just releases more and more insulin, so that in these insulin dysregulated animals, you will get an insulin response that's way over and above what it should be for the amount of glucose that has been released into the bloodstream. So they will release massive amounts of insulin into the blood. And it was a group of incredibly brilliant Australian researchers that figured out that it was actually these really high insulin levels that was causing laminitis in these horses. So they took groups of ponies and groups of standard bred horses and infused the ponies and the horses with elevated levels of insulin while also keeping blood glucose levels normal. And they were able to show that within, I think it was around 72 hours, that every horse and pony had laminitis from the elevated insulin levels. What we still don't know is why insulin causes laminitis. So laminitis being inflammation of the lamellae, and the lamellae are the little, if you look at them under a microscope, they look like interlocked fingers. So if you take your fingers and you interlock them together, the lamellae are just like those interlocked fingers. And one side of the lamellae is on the hoof wall and the other side is on the pedal bone, or the bone inside the hoof capsule. And it's the lamellae's job to hold the hoof wall onto the bone. So they have a very specific job, and they're incredible little structure. They allow the hoof wall to grow very slowly past the bone. And laminitis is an inflammation of that structure. It's incredibly painful. Anyone who's had a horse with laminitis knows just how painful it is and how much effort they will go to get the weight, typically off their front feet, that are most affected, because they're so painful. So we still don't know why insulin causes the inflammation of the lamellae, but we know that it is the insulin that causes the inflammation, and that 90% of laminitis cases that we see are caused by this insulin dysregulation. So by these abnormally high levels of insulin being released in response to a horse or pony absorbing glucose from its small intestine. So the feeds and forages that will cause laminitis are the ones that will cause glucose to go into the bloodstream and then trigger this really high release of insulin from the pancreas. So we know that feeds and forages that are more than 10% non-structural carbohydrate are the ones that will typically trigger an insulin response that is high enough that if it happens often enough, it will cause laminitis. So non-structural carbohydrate is terminology that you'll hear thrown around a lot when we talk about laminitic horses and ponies. And all non-structural carbohydrate is the amount of starch that is contained in a forage or a feed, plus the amount of water-soluble carbohydrate. So when you go starch plus water-soluble carbohydrate together, you get what we call non-structural carbohydrate, which is also abbreviated when you see it written to just NSC. So feeds and forages that are higher than 10% non-structural carbohydrate are typically classified as being unsafe for horses that are really prone to laminitis. If there were feed products that you were feeding very small amounts, so say something like a full-fat soybean, if you were using that in a laminitis-prone horse's diet to add very high-quality protein, but only adding it in, small amounts, say 200 grams or less for a 500 kilogram horse, then it's okay for ingredients that are being used in very small amounts to be a little bit above that 10% non-structural carbohydrate threshold. But certainly for any forages, because, forages make up the bulk of any horse's diet. So for any forages and any feeds that are being fed in quantities greater than a couple of 100 grams a day, you do have to be really careful that you're only using forages and feeds that have got less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate. Now, with feed products, you should be able to see if there's a product that is being marketed as being safe for a laminitic horse, you should be able to see that number on the label, and it should be less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate if the feed is to be considered safe for a laminitic. Forages are a lot harder because unless you have an actual forage analysis on the actual hay that you are buying, you're not going to know what the non-structural carbohydrate of that forage is going to be. So there are some forages that are typically safe, and there are some forages that are almost always unsafe. But without a forage analysis, you can't actually know what's safe and what's not. And I'll talk about the ones that are safe and the ones that typically aren't safe in a moment. The other major factor in causing laminitis is pasture. And in fact, my very first experience with laminitis was way before I knew anything about horse nutrition. I think I was about 17, and my mare that I had at the time, who was also one of the 3 that got laminitis in the summer, that story that I told at the beginning of the podcast, I still had her and she got laminitis again. But when she was young, I was about 17 and she was only really young, 2 or 3 years old. And I was away at university, and I remember my dad saying to me, "Oh, Keela has founder." It was almost always called founder then. And I actually hate to think now what we did with her. I know that my dad got her off the pasture that she was on, but I've no idea what she was fed or what advice we were given in terms of what we should be feeding her. It used to be, the very old advice used to be almost, lock them up and feed them very little, which is definitely not the advice we give horse owners these days and definitely not what you should be doing. But that was my very first experience with laminitis or founder. And typically it was thought of as that type of laminitis being grass founder. And grass founder was so common, and it's still so common. So often horses or ponies that all of a sudden get laminitis, it will often be that they were out on pasture. And typically, though not always, as my story demonstrates, but typically the incidence of laminitis will peak in spring and also in autumn. So let me explain to you why that is, because when you understand a little bit about plant physiology, it will hopefully help you to manage your horses around their laminitis risk, depending on what your pasture is doing during certain seasons. So during spring is particularly high risk, and autumn I also consider high risk. And the reason is that during spring and autumn, the daylight hours in a day are still relatively long. So you've still got a decent amount of sunlight hours in a 24-hour period that the plant can use to photosynthesize. So I don't know how many of you remember back to for some reason I have really vivid memories of my high school photosynthesis lesson where we had a plant underwater with a light shining on it, and we were actually watching the plant produce oxygen. It was really cool, the little oxygen bubble coming out of the leaf. It's always stuck in my mind. But during photosynthesis, plants actually make their own food, which is super cool when you stop to think about what they're doing. But they take energy from sunlight, and they take carbon dioxide from the air and water from the soil, and they use the energy from the sunlight to drive the process where they use the carbon and hydrogen and oxygen from the water and carbon dioxide to make carbohydrate. So they'll make starch and they'll make a whole bunch of other sugars, longer carbohydrates like fructans, and they actually store those starches and sugars and fructan inside their own leaves and stems, and then they'll use those carbohydrates as food to fuel growth. So when the sun is out, green plants will sit there and photosynthesize. They'll create their own carbohydrate. And then they'll later use that carbohydrate to fuel growth. So if a plant is photosynthesizing but also growing, they're actually making their own food, but then they're also eating their own food, and they don't accumulate the starch and water-soluble carbohydrates, which are the ones that we're most interested in from a laminitis perspective. They won't accumulate them. But during spring and autumn, we can have very cold nights. And when the nights are really cold, what happens is the plant kind of goes into a frozen state, I guess. What is it? Suspended animation. So the plant will be sitting there, but because it's so cold, it's not actually metabolizing and eating its food to fuel growth. It's just kind of sitting there because it's too cold for it to grow. But then the next day, when the sun comes out again, so it hasn't eaten its carbohydrate overnight, and then when the sun comes out again, it's able to produce more food, more carbohydrate. So it's got the carbohydrate from the previous day that it didn't eat because it was too cold overnight to grow. And then it will create more carbohydrate if the sun is out again. And then if you get another cold night, again, the plant will just sit there and not eat the food that it created. And then by the third day, it's got carbohydrate from the previous 2 days that it hasn't used overnight because it's too cold, and it will photosynthesize again and create more food. So what happens is the plants during spring and autumn, when you're getting these sunny days but cold, and particularly if it goes below freezing nights, they will produce carbohydrate during the day, but then not use it up at night. And the amount of carbohydrate that they then have stored in their leaf tissue and their stem increases every day. So it goes up and up. And eventually it is going to reach a point where, and it doesn't take very long, it will reach a point where it's above that safe threshold of 10% non-structural carbohydrate on a dry matter basis, and it will put your horses at risk of laminitis, because when your horse goes and eats that high non-structural carbohydrate, so high starch, high sugar plant material, your horse will, when it goes into the small intestine, your horse will digest and absorb the starches and sugars as glucose, and then it's that glucose that triggers that insulin response where they release way more insulin than what they should for the amount of glucose that they've absorbed. That's why these change of season pastures are really quite risky, because they tend to, instead of producing carbohydrate and then using it to grow, they produce carbohydrate and then they shut down because it's so cold overnight, and then they accumulate carbohydrate, which makes them really risky, the spring and autumn really risky. But I do want you to be really conscious of the fact that it's not just spring and autumn that are risky. So when my horses got laminitis, it was January. So very long for me in the Southern Hemisphere. It's the middle of our summer, very long days. And I went and took a pasture sample at the time that they all got laminitis. And I thought, what on earth is going on? And I went out and I took a pasture sample just before the sun came up, which is when the non-structural carbohydrate content of a pasture should be lowest, because the plants had all night to use up any carbohydrate that it made the previous day. And then on the same day, I took a sample to test non-structural carbohydrate just as the sun went down. So that should be peak carbohydrate level. And I've forgotten the exact numbers now, but it went from something like 8% at the 6 a.m. testing up to 20% in the evening sample. So, I was getting this massive accumulation of carbohydrate over the day. And I put it down to, when we dug back through our soil sample analysis and things, those plants were so nutrient deficient, they were so deficient in phosphorus and sulfur, that they were able to photosynthesize, but they couldn't grow because they didn't have the right nutrients. So anything that limits growth of pasture, so in spring and autumn, it's the cold that will often limit their growth. In my situation in the middle of summer, it was nutrient availability, but anything that limits the growth of pasture is going to increase the riskiness of that pasture from a laminitis perspective, because any limitation on growth will cause an accumulation, or has the ability to cause an accumulation of the carbohydrates that will then trigger absorption of glucose, which then triggers the very high insulin response, which then causes the laminitis. So during these change of seasons, so for us in the southern hemisphere, we're coming into spring. For those of you in the northern hemisphere, you're heading into your fall, or what we would call autumn. We're heading into the riskier times of year. So prevention is always better than cure when it comes to laminitis. And if you can catch your horse or pony before it really tips into laminitis, so if you can catch laminitis starting really early, you've got every chance of just stopping it in its tracks before it actually causes any real damage in your horse's feet. To catch laminitis early, the best tip I can give you is to check your horse's digital pulse morning and night. So if you've never checked your horse's digital pulse, it would be a really great idea to go to your vet and say, please show me how to test my horse's digital pulse so that you know that you are doing it properly. But it essentially involves finding the arteries that are running down sort of the outside to the back of your horse's fetlocks. There's one on either side of the fetlock, and you'll put, with very light pressure, a thumb and a finger on the digital artery, and you'll hold your thumb and your finger there and wait to see if you can feel a pulse. So in a normal, healthy, non-painful foot, you shouldn't be able to feel a pulse just with very light pressure. But if you can feel a pulse with light pressure, it's telling you that there's something not right in that foot. It's not necessarily going to tell you that it is laminitis. It could be a hoof abscess. It could be a pain or lameness from something else going on in the foot. But if you know that your horse normally doesn't have a digital pulse, and you're also concerned about risk of laminitis, or certainly if your horse has had laminitis in previous seasons or at any previous time, and you check for a digital pulse and you feel one, that's your indication that something's not right and you need to take action really quickly. And you're better off taking action on a hunch that something's not right than waiting for it to get much worse before you take action. So the digital pulses are tricky too. We just had a situation here with Popcorn, who was one of the horses back in my story 10 years ago. She was I think she was a 2-year-old, and she had laminitis in that summer period. So I watch her like a hawk now, particularly at this time of year. And my daughter was riding her and something wasn't right. She just didn't look right. Something didn't feel right. And I went and checked her digital pulses, and she had a pulse just in one foot. She also had these funky shoes on that we'd never used before. And so I wasn't really sure whether it was the shoe causing pain, which in the end that is what it turned out to be, or whether there was something going on with laminitis. And it had me so baffled because she was in work, she was eventing fit. She shouldn't have been at high risk of laminitis at that point in time, and it was also the middle of winter. So, it's typically a lower risk period in the middle of winter because the day lengths are so short that the plants don't have a lot of time to actually accumulate much carbohydrate. Anyway, I was checking her digital pulses, and I happened to be at a conference with Dr Melody Delat, who is one of the brilliant researchers who's done so much of the work in this area. And I said to Melody, can I please ask you a question about one of my horses? Because I so rarely get to ask people questions about my horses. And I was chatting to her about the digital pulse. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's only in the left front foot. Sometimes it's only in the right front foot. And Melody said to me that during the research they were doing in actually triggering laminitis with the high insulin, infusing high insulin levels, during the really early phases, the digital pulse was very sporadic. So sometimes they would feel it, sometimes they wouldn't, and it could switch from foot to foot. So sometimes your near side front would have a pulse, and then sometimes it wouldn't. So what I took away from that conversation was it's really important to check the digital pulse regularly. So morning and evening, and in the middle of the day if you're around your horses in the middle of the day. Essentially anytime you get anywhere near them, check the digital pulse. And if you feel one, it's more than likely telling you that something's happening and you need to take action. And that action is, my advice is just act fast. If you feel a digital pulse in a horse that's at risk of laminitis, and definitely if it's a horse that's had laminitis previously, act fast, and your action is get it off pasture, if it's on pasture, and get it onto a safe hay. So a safe hay is a hay that you have purchased with a test of non-structural carbohydrate, or you've had it tested for non-structural carbohydrate, and it will be less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate. And one of my biggest pieces of advice to you in this area is, if you have got horses that are at risk of laminitis, please have in your shed, stored somewhere with a big note on it saying do not use, so that it doesn't accidentally get used up for other purposes, a bale of hay that you know is safe. And if you've got more than one horse that's at risk of laminitis, or if you live in a part of your country where it's difficult to get safe hay, have as much safe hay stored away as you can, because that way, if you pick up that a horse is tipping into laminitis, so if you pick up that your horse has got a digital pulse, you can take them off the pasture and get them onto a safe hay and just let their whole system settle back down again. And you kind of, in doing that, you do have the chance of stopping the disease process in its tracks, because when you take away the feed or the forage that's driving the really elevated insulin responses, you're taking away essentially what causes the disease, and you're just letting everything kind of settle back down. I described it recently as it being like having a fire blanket in your kitchen. So if are cooking dinner and you happen to catch dinner alight, touch wood, not something that I've ever done, but I do have a fire blanket there. If you happen to catch dinner alight, you grab the fire blanket, throw it over the stove, fire gets put out, and you've got very little, if no damage has happened, other than maybe to the fire blanket, but you can easily replace that one. But if you don't have a fire blanket there and dinner catches alight and you're not able to put it out really quickly and your kitchen catches alight, all of a sudden there's so much damage done, there's a lot of time and money to fix it, and you're at risk of losing your entire house. So I look at this, getting horses off pasture and putting them onto the safe hay as being the equivalent of that fire blanket. You're essentially just putting a fire blanket over the disease process, you're letting everything settle back down, and you're catching it before the fire spreads, essentially. You're catching it before there's any real damage done in that hoof. And it's amazing when you can, and I'm speaking from my experience here, it's amazing when you do get them off the pasture really quickly onto that safe hay, how fast they will get back to being sound again and comfortable. So back to being sound at a walk really quickly, and then back to being sound at a trot and canter. Not, within days for the trot and canter, but, within weeks. With my own horses, I wasn't able to pick up any lameness with them, but it was because we caught them really fast. So it's really important too that you don't starve them. So I mentioned earlier on that the old approach to this was, horses got founder, you virtually lock them up and starve them. Please don't starve them. It does so much damage. There's so much damage to their gut that will take you a very long time to repair. So they'll end up with gastric ulceration if you starve them. You'll do a whole heap of damage to their microbiome. You'll starve the good bacteria. And it mentally, there is no reason to starve horses from a mental or physical health perspective. So it's really important that you have that safe hay there, so that when you need to pull them off the pasture, you've got something to feed them. So your emergency diet with a laminitic horse is literally just safe hay, and that's the safest thing to feed them. So hays that are typically low in non-structural carbohydrate would be things like Rhodes grass hay, lucerne hay. Often gets a bad rap in this area, and I still hear people say, oh, you can't feed lucerne to laminitic horses. And you can in most cases. It is safe to feed. You obviously don't feed it as the only hay, but you can feed it as part of the diet and part of the safe hay equation for horses that are off pasture and you're needing to just give them a diet to settle down. But just do everything with these horses slowly. So sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit here, but if you notice that they have a digital pulse, or if you notice that they're lame and they're further on down the disease process and you haven't caught them at, just the digital pulse stage, get them off the pasture as quickly as you can, and then just put them on a hay that you know is safe. So if you have a Rhodes grass hay in your shed that you know is safe, just put them on the Rhodes grass hay and just wait until everything mostly settles down for them. So if they're already lame, wait until you can see that they're improving as opposed to getting worse before you add anything else into the diet. So if you wanted to feed a small amount of lucerne or alfalfa in the diet, then initially just get them adapted to a safe grassy hay. And then when you want to introduce the alfalfa into the diet, then do it really slowly. So just bring in small amounts of alfalfa and increase it to the amount you want to feed over 10 to 14 days. And then that gives you the chance to have the confidence to know that, yes, your horse is okay with that hay in the diet. Or if you see that the horse actually gets worse when you start to increase the amount of anything in their diet, then you can quickly pull it back or take it completely out of the diet if your horse is not responding well. But lucerne or alfalfa is more than 90% of the time, in my experience, less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate, which should make it safe. But I have definitely worked with horses over the years that have been prone to laminitis and haven't been able to handle any significant quantity of lucerne in their diet. So do just be a little bit aware. Brilliant in their diet if they tolerate it. And if they don't tolerate it, then obviously don't feed it. Teff hay is typically safe, but it is definitely one that you should buy based on an analysis, because if teff becomes stressed, it will accumulate starch. And I have seen analyses of teff hay that are quite high in starch and therefore quite high in non-structural carbohydrate. Native grass hays are often okay. Often Timothy hay will be safe, but definitely the best option is to buy a hay that has been tested already and with an analysis that you can trust, that you know comes from the batch of hay that you're buying, so that you know that the hay what you've got as your safe hay is less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate. Now, if you can't buy hay that's less than 10%, you can soak hay, and that will reduce the amount of non-structural carbohydrate in that hay. And that's something you can do. I mean, you can do that long term, but it adds a lot of extra work into your feed program. But if you have to, you could do it short term, and then longer term, go looking for hay that you can buy on analysis that is less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate to save you the effort of soaking hay. Once your horse is stabilised, so you've taken them off pasture, you've fed them the safe hay, you may have introduced one or two other types of hay into the diet to keep that fibre variety in their diet. It is really important then that we balance their diet. So hay is not enough for these little critters, and it is really important that we bring in enough vitamins and minerals and high quality protein to meet their requirements. And that's where the My Happy Horse nutrition app starts to come into play, because their diets are, even for me as a nutritionist, their diets can be very tricky to balance. And what you feed them really does depend on the quality of hay that you are feeding and the type of hay that you're feeding and how much hay you are feeding. So my advice is to use the My Happy Horse virtual nutritionist to put together your laminitis-prone horse's diet, particularly when always horses will benefit from a balanced diet, but it's particularly important when you've got these horses locked up off pasture, because if you're feeding hay that's, say, been stored for more than 12 months, and this is the situation I'm in at the moment, I always have quite a large stack of safe hay in my shed, but nearly all of my grassy hay now has been sitting in my shed for more than 12 months. So I try to rotate it and use it up as often as I can, but it's nearly all been sitting there for 12 months, which means that there is going to be zero vitamin A or vitamin E content in that hay. So if you're feeding a laminitic horse a diet that is based on that hay, then their vitamin A and vitamin E intake is going to be really low. And it's really important, especially from a disease process and an immune function process, and, allowing them to rebuild any damaged tissue in their hooves process. It's super important that they have all of their vitamin and mineral requirements met. And if it's a low quality hay, it's going to be quite low in quality protein. So it's also really important that you get some good quality protein in there so that they can fix up any damage that might have been done to their hooves. Most of the diets that I would do for a laminitic horse would look something like 2% of the horse's body weight in hay. So if it's a 500 kilogram horse, that's 10 kilos of hay per day. If it's a 250 kilogram pony, that's 5 kilograms of hay per day. And that's the minimum amount. If I can find hay that's low enough in quality to give them more, I will give them more. I would typically also have some straw mixed in there, and they can have as much straw as they want to eat because the straw gives them something to chew on and it fills them up and it keeps them mentally and physically occupied without overdoing their calorie intake. I try to have as many different types of hay as I can, just for fibre variety, so that I'm maintaining the health of the hindgut, which, if you go back through the podcast, there's a whole podcast on feeding for hindgut health, and I talk a lot about fibre variety in that, if you'd like to go and have a listen to that. And then there'll usually be either a concentrated vitamin and mineral supplement and something like some full-fat soybean or some lupins or both for high-quality protein, or I'll use a balancer pellet that brings in some high-quality protein as well as the vitamins and minerals that the horse needs. So something like that. So lots of hay, lots of different types of hay and some high-quality protein, and then a balancer pellet and vitamin mineral supplement or vitamin mineral supplement to make sure that all of their vitamin and mineral requirements are being met. I do want to just make a note here that you need to be really aware of marketing in this space. There are lots of feed and supplement products on the market that will say safe for laminitic horses, or they will say, grain-free, low starch, things like that. And if you don't have your wits about you, you might fall into thinking that these products are safe for laminitic horses, but they're not. I don't know how else to say that other than just keep your wits about you. Unless a feed specifies that it is less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate, then it's not going to be safe for a laminitic horse. Please keep your eye out for and always read the ingredients list on a label. So there are lots of feed products, and I don't understand why, but there are lots of feed products on the market, and it doesn't matter what country you're in, it happens all over the world, that say grain-free, and then you'll read the ingredients list and the first one or two ingredients will be grain-derived. So there'll be wheat byproducts or corn byproducts. There'll be something that is derived from grain, and those feeds are just they're not safe for laminitic horses, and they're definitely not grain-free. So do be really wary when it comes to marketing in this space, and make sure you read your ingredients list. I can't tell you how many horses over the years that I've worked with that the poor owner is at their wits' end, believing that they're feeding a diet that is meant to be suitable for laminitic horses, but can't get the horse sound. The horse is still laminitic, it's still very sore. And I look at the diet and there's an ingredient in there, something like a wheat byproduct, that is just consistently triggering that horse's insulin dysregulation and causing very high insulin responses every time that feed is fed, which means the horse is staying in that laminitic state. The My Happy Horse Nutrition app will identify safe feed and supplement products for you, and it will also identify the unsafe feed and supplement products for you based on ingredient lists and non-structural carbohydrate levels. So for the safe ones, look for no grain or grain byproducts and a label listing of less than 10% non-structural carbohydrate to be truly safe. Safe feed ingredients are things like, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, lupins. I've said it a few times before, I don't know how the rest of the world cope without having access to lupins, but lupins are beautiful, always safe and always low in non-structural carbohydrates, so they're a really beautiful feed ingredient. And so are lupin hulls for laminitic horses, just depending on how much energy your horse needs. So often laminitic horses are also very overweight. Not always, so it's not a rule, but we're often trying to reduce their weight as we feed them. So lupins and lupin hulls are, of course, high energy ingredients. So this is where balancing these diets with the My Happy Horse Nutrition app becomes really important, because it allows you to balance energy intake and also their proteins, vitamins and minerals intake. Ingredients like unmolassed sugar beet pulp can be safe, but you do need to be really wary with sugar beet pulp because the level of non-structural carbohydrate can be quite variable. So if you have got a risky horse, then soaking and rinsing for a few cycles will help to wash the residual sugar out of the sugar beet pulp. Copra meal, I did some research years ago to show that copra meal has a very low glycemic and insulin response post-feeding, so it's a nice one to use if you need to add a little bit of either extra ingredient variety in there, or you have got a laminitic horse that does need some additional calorie. Or you might have a performance horse that is prone to laminitis. So a lot of these high energy ingredients, so your lupin hulls and your beet pulp and your copper meal, they're high energy, so you can use them to fuel performance, but you're also minimizing the risk of triggering laminitis in your performance horse. And then grazing, a question I get a lot is, when is it safe for horses to graze? And there is so much confusion about this, but all you need to remember is that during the day when the sun's out, plants make carbohydrate. So at the end of the day, they're going to be the highest in carbohydrate that they will be for that 24-hour period. And then overnight, when there is no sun and there's no photosynthesis, they use up their carbohydrate. So the carbohydrate level drops, which means that by morning, the plants are going to be, like just before sunrise, the plants are going to be the lowest in non-structural carbohydrate that they will be for that 24-hour period. Remembering that if you've got that combination of sunny days and cold nights, the carbohydrate will accumulate. So it doesn't necessarily mean that first thing in the morning is going to be safe. But during periods of time when you've got nights that are warm enough for the plant to be using up their carbohydrate, the safest time to graze any horse that's prone, or pony that's prone to laminitis, is first thing in the morning. And my general rule of thumb is to graze them 2 hours before sunrise if you're up that early, to no more than 2 hours after sunrise. So that 4-hour window there is going to be when your carbohydrate levels are going to be lowest. Do make use of cloudy days, and particularly runs of cloudy days. So when it's cloudy, plants don't photosynthesize nearly as much. And so first thing in the morning after a cloudy day is going to be, especially if it was reasonably warm overnight, that is going to be your safest time to graze. So keep that in mind and make good use of those, the days of or the days after cloudy days. If you're unsure with grazing and your horse, particularly if your horse has only just been symptomatic, you should avoid grazing. If you're not sure, was it too cold last night? Is it going to be safe to put them out on pasture? If there's any doubt, just leave them in for that day and feed them like plenty of hay locked in. The other couple of really handy tools you can use for grazing, if you want to let them graze but you also want to limit the amount you can graze, is a grazing muzzle. Brilliant for reducing the amount of pasture that your horse can eat. So if you, and also really handy when you're just starting to re-release a horse that has been locked in because it has been symptomatic. Good for releasing them back out on pasture to kind of just test the water and see how well they'll handle it. So instead of just letting a horse out, even if it is, really early in the morning before the sun's come up, you might like to put a grazing muzzle on that horse so that, for the first week, 2 weeks, month that you put them back out, if you're a little bit unsure of how it's going to go, if they go out to graze with a grazing muzzle on, they still get the stimulation of grazing. They'll still get a little bit of pasture intake, but you're just really restricting how much pasture they can actually eat. And then my best friend in this space of managing my horses that are prone to laminitis is strip grazing. So I strip graze my easy keepers, my laminitis-prone horses. I strip graze them all year round. They're always strip grazed. They live in a track, so in the really fortunate position of having a track that's almost a kilometre long, and they'll walk from water out to feed and back again a couple of times a day on that track. But what the strip grazing also allows me to do is to just give them a very defined amount of grass for that day. I'll move their strip fence. Ideally, you move it before the sun comes up, and then they're grazing that fresh pasture really early in the morning when it's lowest in non-structural carbohydrate. And even without taking into account laminitis risk, if you've just got horses that are really good doers and you're trying to keep weight on them, that really early morning period is also when pastures are lowest in energy or calories, because they haven't created their day's worth of non-structural carbohydrate and things like fructans yet. So there's less carbohydrate sitting in the leaves and stems of any plant early in the morning. So if you're getting your horses, your good doers, to graze first thing in the morning, you've got more chance of also managing their weight effectively. But that brings me to the end of what I want to talk about today for laminitis. I do apologise for my voice today. I have had a really scratchy throat for the last week and a half, and I've been waiting to record this podcast, but we had it flagged in the Horse Deals magazine as being podcast number 15, so I've recorded it today so that it can be released as podcast 15, but I do apologise for the sound of my voice. I hope that you were able to take something away from that will help you manage your laminitic horses. Know that it is a tricky condition to manage. It worries me, and this is my profession. So if you're feeling anxious about it or you're feeling unsure, then just know that I would expect that to be perfectly normal, because it's a tricky one to manage. We are more than happy to try and help you with laminitis cases. If you need help, you can jump onto Dr Nerida AI on our myhappy.horse website. And of course, we would love you to go and download the My Happy Horse nutrition app and use that to manage the diet of your laminitics. But thank you very much for being with me, and I will catch you next time.